He's going to kill me, isn't he? I asked the question in a quiet, trembling whisper, blood dripping slowly from a sharp gash on my forehead. My right cheek felt swollen and hot, and my wrist was bent at an unnatural, excruciating angle against my side. Standing directly over me in the damp, dimly lit concrete parking garage was my husband, Julian, holding the heavy bronze award he had just accepted at his firm's annual charity gala. Behind him, 3 of his high-powered executive colleagues stood frozen in stunned, suffocating silence. Julian didn't look remorseful. He casually adjusted his silk tie, stepped over my leather purse lying open on the oily pavement, and leaned in close. "You're a miserable, pathetic nobody, Maya," he sneered, making sure his voice carried across the empty concrete bays. "I made you. I gave you a life. And if you ever humiliate me in front of my peers again by speaking out of turn, a broken wrist will be the absolute least of your problems. Get out of my sight." No one moved. No one picked up a phone to dial 911. They just watched as I dragged myself up against a cold pillar, clutching my arm, shivering violently in the dark air. That was Julian's first mistake. But that's not where this story began. To the rest of the world, Julian Vance was a brilliant, rising corporate litigator, a charismatic partner at Vance, Sterling & Associates, who seemed destined for absolute greatness. To me, he was a master captor. When we married 4 years ago, the subtle isolation began almost immediately. First, it was gentle suggestions to step back from my freelance design work. Then, it was lost mail, monitored phone calls, and abruptly cut off friendships. Within 2 years, I was completely dependent on him. Because I had been raised mostly by extended family after my parents passed away early in my youth, Julian assumed I had no safety net, no allies, no heavy hitters in my corner. He treated me like a stray dog he had rescued from the street, one he could kick whenever he had a difficult day at the office. He made sure all our assets were solely in his name, kept my bank account perpetually near zero, and gave me a strict weekly allowance like a child. Every single day, he reminded me how worthless I was. "Look at you," he'd sneer over breakfast, flicking a drop of coffee onto my silk blouse. "Without my income, you'd be sleeping on a park bench. You have nothing, you are nothing." I remained quiet. I swallowed the insults, kept my head down, and never whined. I knew that throwing a tantrum would only make the beatings worse. So I waited. I endured. Nobody in that house knew the truth. 14 days before the gala, a quiet seismic shift occurred. My late mother's brother, Uncle David, returned to the country after spending 15 long years abroad. Growing up, David was a mythic figure in our family. A brilliant, intensely private man who had moved overseas shortly after I turned 10 to build an international logistics empire. Over 15 years, he had faded into a family legend, living entirely off the grid while accumulating unfathomable influence across Europe and Asia. When David landed in the city, I arranged to meet him secretly at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. Julian was out of state on a business trip, giving me a rare 4-hour window of freedom. I sat at a corner booth, trembling, wearing a thick turtleneck despite the warm afternoon to hide the dark bruises framing my collarbone. When Uncle David walked in, wearing a tailored dark suit, possessing an aura of calm, unshakable authority, he froze the moment his eyes landed on me. He slipped into the booth across from me. He didn't speak right away. He simply reached out and gently laid his hand over my trembling, bruised fingers. "Maya," he said quietly, his voice deep and smooth as velvet. "What happened to you?" The dam broke. The tears I had held back for 4 years came rushing out. In hushed, panicked whispers, I confessed everything: the emotional torment, the financial imprisonment, the physical violence, and the terrifying isolation. I told him how Julian tracked my phone, how he threatened to ruin my life if I ever left, and how utterly trapped I felt. Uncle David listened to every word without interrupting. His expression didn't change, but his pale blue eyes hardened into cold, polished granite. When I finally finished, wiping my face with a paper napkin, Uncle David leaned back. A slight, terrifyingly calm grin crossed his lips. "Book a hotel room under my company's corporate name tonight and rest up," he reassured me softly. "We'll play his game starting tomorrow, but strictly by my rules. Remember that detail. It matters later." For the next 2 weeks, I obeyed Uncle David's precise instructions. I went back home. I acted timid. I let Julian believe he was in absolute control. Julian's arrogance reached astronomical heights. Emboldened by my submission, he began preparing for the biggest night of his career, the annual acquisition banquet, where his firm was set to sign a high-stakes merger with an elusive global investment firm known only as Aegis Global Holdings. Julian was slated to become the managing partner of the new joint entity, a position that carried a multi-million-dollar annual salary and unlimited prestige. "This merger is my legacy, Maya," Julian boasted over dinner 3 nights before the event, cutting into a steak while I sat across from him with a bruised wrist he had twisted 2 days prior. "The chairman of Aegis is flying in personally to sign the final papers. When this deal goes through, I will be untouchable." "That's wonderful, Julian," I said softly, staring down at my plate. He chuckled condescendingly. "Try not to look so pathetic at the gala. Wear a long-sleeve dress. Hide those marks. You look like a mess." He had no idea that every time he spoke, every time he threatened me, a tiny digital recorder pinned underneath my collar was capturing every single word. They had no idea what was coming. The night of the gala arrived. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis was packed with elite attorneys, politicians, and corporate titans. Julian strutted through the room like a king preparing to claim his crown, dragging me behind him like a disobedient pet. Halfway through the evening, Julian took me into the back parking garage to retrieve a document from his car. When I accidentally dropped his leather briefcase, spilling his papers onto the ground, he snapped. That was when he struck me, breaking my wrist, and delivered his cruel speech in front of his stunned colleagues. "Get out of my sight," he hissed again, turning his back on me to walk back toward the elevators, leaving me bleeding on the concrete. He thought I would crawl into a corner and cry. He thought I was broken. Instead, I stood up straight. I pulled a small handkerchief from my clutch, wiped the blood from my forehead, and walked directly toward the main elevators behind him. I took a separate lift up to the main ballroom. This is where everything changed. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom, the room was silent. Julian was standing on the elevated stage next to his senior partners, holding a golden pen, ready to execute the merger documents alongside the legal team from Aegis Global. Julian caught sight of me standing at the back of the hall, disheveled, bloody, my arm cradling my broken wrist. His face flushed with pure rage. "Security!" Julian barked into the microphone, his voice echoing over the speakers. "Remove this woman immediately. She's unstable." 2 security guards moved toward me, but before they could take 2 steps, a commanding voice echoed from the side entrance. "Touch her, and I will tear this entire building down, brick by brick." The crowd gasped. Walking onto the stage wasn't a team of security officers. It was Uncle David, flanked by 4 federal prosecutors and the head of the State Bar Association. Julian blinked, utterly confused. "Who the hell are you?" "This is a private corporate signing. Security, get him out." Uncle David didn't even look at the guards. He walked directly to the podium, pulled the microphone toward himself, and looked down at Julian with that same slight, cold grin. "My name is David Sterling," he said calmly. "I am the founder, majority shareholder, and chief executive officer of Aegis Global Holdings." A wave of shock rippled through the room. Pens dropped. Whispers exploded like wildfire. Julian's face drained of every ounce of color. His hand began to shake so violently, the golden pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the hardwood floor. "You," Julian stammered, his confidence evaporating into thin air. "You're her uncle?" "I am," David said softly, "and you have been playing my game for 2 weeks." Uncle David tapped his tablet, and within seconds, the massive LED screens behind the stage flared to life. It wasn't corporate slides. It was a high-definition video playing from the parking garage just 15 minutes ago. The room watched in horrified silence as Julian struck me, snapped my wrist, and snarled those monstrous words. "You are a miserable, pathetic nobody. A broken wrist will be the least of your problems." Gasps rang out across the hall. Several women in the front row covered their mouths in horror. As the majority owner of Aegis Global, Uncle David's voice boomed softly over the speakers. "I am officially canceling the merger with Vance, Sterling and Associates, effective immediately, citing severe reputational hazard and ethical violations." Julian fell to his knees on the stage. "Wait, please. David, listen to me. It was a misunderstanding. She provoked me. Furthermore," Uncle David continued, ignoring Julian completely, "I have spent the last 10 days purchasing 90% of the debt held by your law firm. As of 5 minutes ago, I have foreclosed on your firm's assets. Vance, Sterling and Associates is insolvent. The managing partners beside Julian shrank back in absolute terror, distancing themselves from him as if he carried a deadly plague. Then, the lead federal prosecutor stepped forward, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his coat. Julian Vance, you are under arrest for felony domestic assault, witness intimidation, and corporate fraud stemming from the offshore accounts we uncovered during Aegis's audit of your personal records. The entire room watched as Julian, the man who thought he was untouchable, the man who called me a nobody, was slammed face down onto the stage, cuffed, and dragged out through the center aisle in tears, begging me for forgiveness as he passed. I didn't say a word. I just stood tall, looking him dead in the eye, perfectly calm. 6 months later, the dust finally settled. Julian was sentenced to 8 years in state prison without the possibility of early parole, his law license permanently revoked, and every cent he had ever accumulated seized to pay for my medical bills, restitution, and legal fees. His former firm dissolved overnight, leaving his name a pariah in the legal community. As for me, I didn't spend a second wallowing. With Uncle David's backing, I launched my own nonprofit foundation dedicated to providing legal protection, emergency housing, and financial independence for victims of domestic abuse. I no longer hide behind long sleeves. I no longer flinch when a door closes. I am free, whole, and stronger than I have ever been.